He trusted, loved, and gave himself completely. But just hours after saying "I do," an envelope revealed a betrayal. His wife had accepted money before the wedding. But was everything as it seemed? As he investigates, he uncovers a secret capable of turning his world upside down. And it might be too late. The ballroom of the majestic hotel sparkled in golden hues on that memorable night. Carefully arranged crystals reflected the light of hundreds of candles, creating an ethereal atmosphere that seemed straight out of a fairy tale. Richard Fitzgerald Thompson, at 38 years old, watched the last remaining guests at the party while discreetly adjusting the tie of his custom-made Italian tuxedo. As CEO of one of the country's largest technology companies, he was accustomed to making important decisions that affected thousands of lives, but none of them compared to the choice he had made that night. His marriage to Hannah Davis, a 28-year-old teacher, had been the most talked about topic in New York's social circles for the past few months. The difference between their worlds was evident. While he frequented the most exclusive restaurants and traveled in his private jet, she had grown up in the Bronx, the daughter of a seamstress and a street vendor. But it was precisely this simplicity that had won him over from the first moment he saw her, during a visit he made to a public school where his company was developing a social project. "I finally found someone who loves me for who I am, not for what I have," he thought, as his eyes scanned the room until they found Hannah. She looked stunning in her wedding dress, animatedly chatting with some friends from the school where she taught. Her smile lit up the room in a way that no crystal chandelier could. However, something subtly bothered him. In the last few weeks, before the wedding, Hannah had seemed more distant, worried. Richard attributed this to natural pre-wedding jitters, but now, mentally reviewing the events, he noticed small details that had previously gone unnoticed. "Mr. Thompson?" The deep, familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. It was Charles Vanderbilt, his lawyer and longtime friend, who was watching him with a serious expression. "Can I speak with you in private?" Richard nodded, following Charles to a more secluded area of the ballroom. The lawyer seemed uncomfortable, nervously fidgeting with a manila envelope he was carrying. "Richard, you know I've always been concerned about your well-being, right?" Charles began, carefully choosing his words. "And sometimes, as a friend, we need to do difficult things." The businessman felt a chill down his spine. He had known Charles for more than 2 decades, and he had never seen him so hesitant. "What's going on, Charles? Be direct." The lawyer took a deep breath and extended the envelope. "This arrived at my office yesterday. I didn't want to ruin your day, but you need to see this." With slightly trembling hands, Richard opened the envelope. Inside was a series of documents, bank statements, photos, and most disturbingly, a bank transfer receipt for a considerable amount to an account in Hannah's name, dated just 3 days before the wedding. "This can't be true," Richard muttered, feeling the blood freeze in his veins. "There must be some mistake." "I checked everything thoroughly," Charles replied, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. "The transfer is real, and there's more. I have evidence that there was a meeting between Hannah and the person responsible for the transfer at a cafe downtown 1 day before the money was deposited." Richard felt the world spin. Charles's words echoed in his mind as his certainties crumbled one by one. He looked at Hannah again, who was now dancing happily with her bridesmaids. How could she seem so genuine, so true, while keeping such a dark secret? "What do you intend to do?" Charles asked, carefully observing his friend's reaction. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, trying to organize his thoughts. His entire life had been guided by rationality, by control. But now, for the first time, he felt completely lost. "The honeymoon," he finally said, his voice assuming an icy tone that Charles had never heard before. "I booked the penthouse suite. I'll confront her there. I want to hear from her own mouth. I want her to look me in the eyes and explain why she did this." Charles tried to argue. "Maybe it's better to wait. Think calmly." "No," Richard interrupted, putting the documents in the inside pocket of his jacket. "I've spent my entire life being used by self-interested people. I thought it would be different with her. I need to know the truth. Now." The rest of the party passed like a blur. Richard maintained appearances, smiling mechanically at guests, dancing when necessary, but his mind was focused on a single moment, the confrontation that was to come. He watched Hannah say goodbye to her friends with warm hugs, some tears of emotion escaping her eyes. Fake tears, he thought bitterly. How could I have been so naive? When they finally went up to the penthouse, Hannah seemed nervous, but Richard attributed this to what he imagined was guilt. She walked to the balcony, admiring the night view of New York, while he closed the door with a soft click. It was all a game for you, wasn't it? His voice cut through the silence like a blade. Hannah turned, confused. What are you talking about, Richard? He took the documents from his pocket and threw them on the coffee table. This explains a lot. Your nervousness in recent weeks, the secret phone calls, the mysterious meetings. She slowly approached the table, her face losing color as she recognized the papers. Her hands trembled as she picked up the documents. Richard, I can explain. Explain what? He exploded. Years of distrust and past hurts coming to the surface. How you pretended to love me. How you planned all this. How long did it take for you to realize I would be an easy target? Tears began to stream down Hannah's face, smudging her perfect makeup. But she didn't defend herself, didn't deny. She just stood there crying silently, which for Richard was the final confirmation of her guilt. Your silence says it all, he said, his voice laden with bitterness. You know what's worse? I really believed in you. I thought I had found someone different. Hannah tried to approach, but he backed away as if her touch could burn him. Please, Richard. It's not what you're thinking. Isn't it? Then tell. Me, Hannah. Tell me why you received this money days before our wedding. Tell me why you secretly met with these people. Tell me why you lied to me. The silence that followed was deafening. Hannah hugged herself, as if trying to protect herself while the tears continued to fall. I can't, she finally whispered. I can't tell you. Not yet. Richard laughed humorlessly. Of course you can't, because there's no explanation, is there? It was all a farce, a well-elaborated scam, and I, like an idiot, fell for every detail. He walked to the window, observing the city lights that blinked indifferently to the drama unfolding in that penthouse. So many times he had been warned about scammers, about people who only approached him out of self-interest. But Hannah seemed different. Her simplicity, her dedication to work, her genuine affection for her students. How could it all have been a lie? First thing tomorrow, my lawyers will file for annulment, he finally said, without turning to look at her. Don't worry about your reputation. We'll say it was a mutual decision, but I want you out of my life. Completely. Richard. Her voice was just a broken whisper. I've already called for another room for myself, he continued, still with his back turned. You can stay here tonight. Tomorrow I want you to pack your things and leave. I never want to see your face again. With those words, he walked to the door, his heavy steps echoing in the silence of the room. Before leaving, he paused for a moment, his hand on the doorknob. You know what's most ironic? I really loved you. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Hannah alone with her tears and her secrets. Outside, Richard leaned against the wall of the corridor, feeling the weight of his own words. How could he have imagined that his fairy tale would end like this, on the very night it was supposed to begin? But as he walked to his new room, something bothered him. Why had Hannah, always so strong and determined, not defended herself? Why had she just cried without trying to explain? And why, even after all this, did her eyes still show so much love when they looked at him? The morning after the wedding dawned grey in New York, as if the sky shared the newlyweds' state of mind. Hannah remained seated in the same armchair where she had spent the sleepless night, still wearing her now wrinkled wedding dress. Her red and swollen eyes stared at the horizon through the penthouse's panoramic window, while her mind relived every moment of the previous night. Her cell phone vibrated for the 100th time, another message from her mother, Mrs. Olivia. Davis. Hannah took a deep breath before finally answering. Honey, for God's sake, what happened? I'm worried. Her mother's weak and breathless voice made Hannah's heart tighten even more. It was for her that she was going through all this, It was for her that she carried this silent burden. "Everything's fine, Mom," she lied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I just needed to sort out a few things. Did you take your medicine today?" "Don't." "Change the subject, Hannah. Richard called here looking for you. He seemed upset." Hannah closed her eyes, feeling new tears form. How could she explain to her mother that her marriage had ended before it even began? How could she tell her that the man she loved now considered her a scammer? "Mom, I need to sort out a few things. I promise we'll talk better later. Please don't worry about me. Just take care of your health." After hanging up, Hannah finally gathered the strength to stand up. She walked to the bathroom and faced her reflection in the mirror. The smudged makeup created dark shadows under her eyes, making her look years older. Who was that woman staring back at her? Did she still recognize herself? Her mind went back to 6 months ago when everything started to change. She was teaching at the public school, where she had worked for 5 years when Richard appeared, for a visit related to his company's social project. He stood out in his impeccable suit, but it was his kindness towards the children that first caught her attention. That day, as he observed her class on American literature, Hannah felt something different in the air. The way he looked at her, how he smiled seeing her interact with the students, there was genuine admiration there. The meetings that followed were like a dream. Richard didn't care about her humble origins. On the contrary, he seemed fascinated by her worldview, by her dedication to teaching. For the first time, Hannah allowed herself to believe she had found true love. But then came her mother's diagnosis, a rare disease that required expensive experimental treatment in Switzerland. Despair took over her life. As a public school teacher, her salary barely covered basic expenses, and now she needed an amount she could never gather. It was at that moment that she received that mysterious phone call. "Miss Hannah Davis." The female voice on the other end of the line was soft but authoritative. "I need to talk to you about your mother and about Richard Thompson." The meeting took place in a discreet cafe downtown. The woman, who introduced herself only as Sarah, had a proposal that would change her life forever. "We know about your mother's health condition," said Sarah, pushing an envelope across the table. "And we also know about your relationship with Richard Thompson. We're willing to pay for your mother's complete treatment, with one condition." Hannah felt a chill run down her spine as she remembered that conversation. At the time, her hands were shaking so much she could barely hold the coffee cup. "What condition?" Sarah's smile was enigmatic. "You must marry Richard Thompson as soon as possible, and never under any circumstances can you tell him about our conversation or about the money." "But why? Who are you?" "That's not relevant at the moment," Sarah replied, standing up. "You have 24 hours to decide. Think carefully, Hannah. Your mother's life is in your hands." Back in the present, Hannah felt nauseous remembering that moment. How could she choose between her mother's life and the trust of the man she loved? She already loved Richard even before that proposal, but now he would never believe. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Her heart raced, thinking it might be Richard. But it was just a housekeeper bringing a message. Her belongings had already been transferred to another room, and she should leave the penthouse in an hour. As she packed her things, Hannah found the small notebook where she used to write down her thoughts. She opened it to a random page and found something she had written weeks before the wedding. "How do I tell the truth without losing everything I love? How do I protect my mother without destroying my heart? Richard, if you ever discover everything, will you understand that sometimes love demands impossible sacrifices?" At the other end of the hotel, Richard also hadn't slept. He spent the night pacing back and forth in his room, alternating between anger and deep sadness. Charles's words echoed in his mind, along with memories of happy moments with Hannah. Picked up his phone and started doing what he knew best: investigate. As CEO of one of the country's largest technology companies, he had resources and connections. In a few hours, his security team had already traced the money trail. The transfer had been made by a shell company, which in turn received resources from various offshore companies. "Mr. Thompson," his assistant's voice sounded through the phone. "We found something interesting about the transfer. The money, it didn't stay in Mrs. Hannah's account. It was transferred almost immediately to a clinic in Switzerland. Richard frowned. A clinic? What kind of clinic? We're trying to find out, sir, but it's an institution specialized in experimental treatments for rare diseases. Something started to stir in Richard's mind. He remembered how Hannah always seemed worried when she talked on the phone with her mother, how sometimes he caught her crying secretly after these calls. At the time, he attributed this to the stress of wedding preparations, but now, keep investigating, he ordered. I want to know everything about this clinic and why Hannah transferred the money there. After hanging up, Richard walked to the window. The city was beginning to wake up below, indifferent to the dramas unfolding in the heights. He found himself thinking about how he met Hannah, about how she was different from all the other women he had ever known. He remembered the day he proposed to her, at a simple dinner at her place. She had insisted on cooking, even though she lived in a small apartment with a tiny kitchen. The rice had burned a little, but she laughed at her own mistake in such a genuine way that it made him fall in love even more. Why, Hannah, he muttered to himself. Why accept money if you already had my heart? The sound of his cell phone brought him back to reality. It was Charles again. Richard, we need to talk. I discovered something about the woman who met with Hannah before the transfer. You won't believe it when you find out who she is. Charles was waiting for Richard in his office in Midtown Manhattan, the glass walls offering a privileged view of the city that was beginning to be covered by twilight. On his desk, a red folder contained information that could completely change the course of this story. Sarah Thompson, Charles said as soon as Richard entered the room. That's the full name of the woman who met with Hannah. Richard froze at hearing the surname. Thompson, but that's impossible. It's not impossible. It's just unlikely, Charles replied, opening the folder. Sarah Thompson is your second cousin, daughter of your Uncle Alexander, the one your family never mentions. Richard's legs weakened and he needed to sit down. Alexander Thompson had been banished from the family decades ago after a scandal involving his grandfather's will. Richard was just a child at the time, but he remembered the screams, the accusations, the slamming doors. But what would Sarah have to do with Hannah? What would be her interest in our marriage? Charles pushed some photos across the desk. In them, Sarah appeared at different moments, leaving business meetings, getting into luxury cars, always with a determined expression on her face. Your cousin has built her own empire in recent years, Charles explained. Vertex Enterprises, the one that's trying to compete with your company in the technology sector? It's hers. Richard picked up the photos with trembling hands. Sarah had the same characteristic green eyes of the Thompsons, the same proud bearing. How had he never made the connection before? So all this, was it revenge? An attempt to get to me through my marriage? Maybe, Charles replied thoughtfully, but there's something else. We discovered that the clinic in Switzerland where the money was transferred belongs to a research group funded by Vertex Enterprises. Richard abruptly stood up, walking to the window. His mind was working furiously, trying to connect the pieces of this puzzle. I need to talk to Hannah, he said finally. Are you sure? After everything we've discovered, precisely because of that, Richard interrupted. There's something bigger happening here, Charles. And Hannah might be both victim and culprit. Meanwhile, in a small apartment in Queens, Hannah was trying to console her mother, who hadn't stopped crying since she learned about the end of the marriage. Honey, you need to tell me what's going on, Mrs. Davis pleaded, her voice weak. Richard came here this morning asking questions about my treatment, about some woman named Sarah. Hannah paled. Richard was here. What exactly did he ask? He wanted to know about my illness, about how we managed to pay for the treatment. Hannah, why did you never tell me it was him who paid? Mom, please, you need to rest, Hannah deflected, helping Mrs. Davis lie down. The doctor said you can't get agitated. Alone in the small living room, Hannah picked up her cell phone. There were 3 missed calls from Sarah. Her finger hovered over the number, hesitant. Since that meeting at the cafe, Sarah had become a shadowy presence in her life, manipulating events from afar. The cell phone vibrated in her hand. It was a message from Sarah. We need to talk. Now." Hannah felt a chill. She knew she couldn't ignore that call, but she also knew that each encounter with Sarah took her further away from Richard. The place chosen by Sarah was an elegant restaurant in the Upper East Side. Hannah felt out of place in her simple dress, aware of the glances from other patrons. Sarah was already waiting, impeccable in her navy blue suit, her black hair tied in a severe bun. Her green eyes, so similar to Richard's, shone with a disturbing intensity. "You didn't tell him anything, did you?" Sarah asked without preamble. "No," Hannah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "But he's investigating. He found out. About the money, about the clinic." "Let him investigate," Sarah cut her off. "The more he looks, the more confused he'll become. The important thing is that you keep your part of the deal." "Why?" Hannah finally found the courage to ask. "Why do all this? What do you gain by destroying Richard's happiness?" An enigmatic smile appeared on Sarah's lips. "Do you really think this is about destroying his happiness? Oh, Hannah, you have no idea what's really at stake here. Then tell me. I'm tired of lies, of secrets." "All in good time," Sarah replied, standing up. "For now, I just need you to keep following my instructions. Your mother's life still depends on it." After Sarah left, Hannah remained seated, feeling more lost than ever. It was then that she noticed an envelope that Sarah had left on the table. Inside, there was an old photo, a group of people in front of a mansion. In the center, a tall man held two children in his arms, a boy and a girl. Turning the photo over, Hannah found an inscription. "Alexander Thompson with the children, Richard and Sarah, 1990. Her heart raced. Richard and Sarah, siblings. But how was this possible? Outside the restaurant, Richard observed the scene through the glass, his heart torn between anger and confusion. He had followed Hannah there, hoping to confront her, but Sarah's presence changed everything. "Sir," his private investigator said over the phone, "we found something in the old Thompson family archives. There's a will and a birth certificate that was altered." Richard closed his eyes, feeling a headache approaching. "Go on." "According to the documents, Sarah isn't your cousin. She's your sister. And there's more. Your grandfather's will left half of the family fortune to her." The pieces were starting to fit together, forming an image that Richard wasn't sure he wanted to see. But one thing was clear. Hannah was trapped in the middle of a family war that had begun long before she entered their lives. The question now was how to protect the woman he loved without destroying the secrets his own family had buried for so long. The Thompson mansion remained imposing in the Hamptons, its stone walls guarding decades of family secrets. Richard stopped his Porsche in front of the main gate, observing the structure he once called home. It had been years since he had visited his parents. Family gatherings always happened in restaurants or social events, never there. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Charles asked, sitting in the passenger seat. Richard nodded, his expression determined. "I need to know the truth, and there's only one person who can tell me everything." Regina Thompson, his mother, was waiting on the porch, elegant as always in her blue silk ensemble. Her grey hair was impeccably arranged, but her hands, which twisted nervously, betrayed her anxiety. "Son," she said, trying to smile, "what a surprise. I thought you'd be on your honeymoon." "You know very well why I'm here," Richard replied, his voice controlled. "Sarah, I want to know everything." Regina's smile faltered. She cast a worried glance at Charles before indicating that they should enter. The study was exactly as Richard remembered. The mahogany bookshelves full of books, the imposing portrait of his grandfather above the fireplace, the smell of leather and cigars that his father so appreciated. "Your father is traveling," said Regina, sitting in one of the armchairs. "Maybe we should wait." "No," Richard interrupted. "Enough waiting, enough lies. Sarah is my sister, isn't she?" The silence that followed was deafening. Regina closed her eyes as if trying to hold back tears. "It was so long ago," she began, her voice trembling. "Your father, he had a relationship with one of the company's employees. When she got pregnant, we were desperate. The arranged marriage to your mother was about to happen. The merger between the companies depended on it." Richard felt his stomach churn. So you decided to hide everything, pretend Sarah didn't exist. It wasn't quite like that, Regina defended herself. Alexander, your father's brother, couldn't have children. He and his wife agreed to raise Sarah as their daughter. Everything would be perfect, but Sarah's biological mother refused to completely give up her daughter. She threatened to tell everything if she couldn't maintain contact. That's why Alexander had to distance himself from the family, to protect the secret. Richard stood up, walking to the window. Outside, the garden where he used to play as a child seemed smaller, less magical. And Grandpa's will? Why did he leave half the fortune to Sarah? Regina paled. How did you? I have my resources, Mom. What I want to know is, why did you hide this too? Your grandfather discovered the truth at the end of his life, Regina explained. He was always very perceptive. He altered the will without telling anyone, leaving half of everything to Sarah. When he passed away, your father and the family lawyers found a way to contest the document. Sarah was legally Alexander's daughter after all. And so you stole her inheritance, Richard completed, his voice laden with disgust. No, it was all legal, within the law. Legal doesn't mean right, Mom. Meanwhile, in her small apartment, Hannah was receiving an unexpected visit. Megan, her best friend and co-worker, appeared carrying bags of food and a bottle of wine. I'm not going to let you face this alone, Megan declared, entering without ceremony. Hannah tried to smile, but the tears came without warning. Megan dropped the bags and hugged her friend. Tell me everything, she asked. What's really going on? Between sobs, Hannah finally opened up. She told about her mother's illness, about the meeting with Sarah, about the money for the treatment. But there's more, said Hannah, wiping away her tears. Today at the restaurant, I discovered something that changed everything. Sarah doesn't want to destroy Richard. She wants justice. What do you mean? Hannah took out the old photo that Sarah had left. They're siblings, Meg. And the Thompson. Family stole her inheritance, the money she gave me. It was part of what should have been hers by right. Megan examined the photo, shocked. But why you? Why approach Richard through you? Because she knew I truly loved him, Hannah replied, softly. Sarah observed me for months before making contact. She saw how I looked at Richard when he visited the school, how I talked about him in teachers' meetings, and your mother's treatment. It's real. Sarah discovered about the illness and used it, but the treatment is really working. The doctors say she has great chances of... The doorbell interrupted the conversation. When Hannah opened the door, her heart stopped. Richard was standing there, looking exhausted and vulnerable. Can we talk? He asked softly. Megan got the message, grabbing her purse. Before leaving, she hugged Hannah and whispered, "Call me if you need anything." Alone in the small apartment, Richard and Hannah stared at each other in silence. There was so much to be said, so many truths to be revealed. "How's your mother?" Richard finally asked. Hannah blinked, surprised. Of all the possible questions, she hadn't expected that one. She's responding well to the treatment, she answered hesitantly. The treatment that Sarah is paying for? Hannah felt her blood run cold. Richard, No, he raised his hand, interrupting her. Before you say anything, I need you to know. I discovered the truth about Sarah, about who she really is. Tears began to stream down Hannah's face. Forgive me, she whispered. I wanted to tell you everything, but she threatened to cut off your mother's treatment if you spoke, Richard completed, his voice soft. I understand now. Sarah used you to get to me, but not in the way I initially thought. Hannah nodded, unable to speak. Richard approached, gently touching her face. What I don't understand, he continued, is why you didn't come to me before. Why didn't you tell me about your mother's illness? I would have helped, no conditions, no secrets. Because I loved you, Hannah replied, her voice choked. I loved you so much that I was afraid you'd think I was only approaching you for money. And when Sarah appeared, she made me promise. She said it was the only way. Richard pulled her into his arms, feeling her body tremble with contained sobs. We need to fix this, he murmured. All this story, all these lies, it needs to end. On the other side of the city, Sarah observed the photo of her biological father on her desk. Her decades-long plan was finally reaching its crucial moment. But would the price to pay be too high? The headquarters of Vertex Enterprises occupied an entire building on Fifth Avenue, its mirrored facade reflecting the gray sky of that morning. Richard adjusted his tie before entering, feeling the weight of the envelope he carried in his suit jacket. "Mr. Thompson?" The receptionist recognized him immediately. "Miss Sarah is waiting for you on the top floor." Sarah's office was a perfect combination of elegance and power. Dark wood panels covered the walls, and an imposing marble desk dominated the environment. Behind it, through floor-to-ceiling windows, New York stretched as far as the eye could. "See? So you finally discovered," said Sarah without turning around. She was standing by the window observing the city. "Why do all this?" Richard asked, keeping his voice controlled. "Why use Hannah?" Sarah turned slowly, her green eyes, the same eyes as the Thompson family, shining with a disturbing intensity. "You really don't understand, do you?" She smiled humorlessly. "All your life you had everything, the name, the prestige, the inheritance, while I had to build my own path in the shadows." "It wasn't my fault," Richard argued. "I didn't even know. You existed." "Exactly." Sarah's voice rose slightly. "You didn't know. You grew up protected by lies, while I grew up knowing exactly who I was and what they had done to me." Richard placed the envelope on the desk. "I found Grandpa's original, will, and more. I found the letters your biological mother wrote to our father." Sarah froze. "How?" "You're not the only one who knows how to investigate, sister." The last word came out naturally, surprising them both. "I know our family committed terrible mistakes with you, but using Hannah threatening her mother's life, does that make you better than them?" Unexpected tears appeared in Sarah's eyes. "You don't understand. I spent years planning, building, my empire waiting for the right moment. To get revenge? To have justice," she slammed her hand on the desk forcefully. "You think it was easy? Seeing my mother wither away working as a maid, knowing that I was the heir to one of the country's largest fortunes, seeing Alexander, the man who should have protected me as a daughter, being expelled from the family for trying to fight for my rights?" Richard slowly approached. "And Hannah, how does she fit into all this?" Sarah composed herself, returning to her controlled tone. "I observed her for months. I saw how she looked at you, how she talked about you as it was true love. But I also saw when she discovered about her mother's illness, the desperation in her eyes. That's how you manipulated her," Richard concluded, his voice laden with disappointment. "I gave her a choice," Sarah defended herself. "The treatment is real. It's saving her mother's life. And in exchange, she helped me get closer to you, to expose our family's lies. But at what cost? You almost destroyed the love we had for each other." Sarah sat down, suddenly looking tired. Maybe I lost my way. The search for justice ended up turning me into what I despised the most." At that moment, a soft knock on the door interrupted the conversation. Hannah entered, her face showing determination despite her evident nervousness. "Excuse me," she said softly, "but I think it's time we resolve this." Richard and Sarah exchanged surprised looks. "What are you doing here?" Sarah asked. "Doing? What I should have done from the beginning," Hannah replied, approaching. "Sarah, you helped me when I needed it most. My mother's treatment is working, and I'll be eternally grateful for that. But I can't be part of this revenge game anymore." "It's not a game," Sarah protested. "No, it's not," Hannah agreed. "It's your life, your story, your pain. But using other people, manipulating true feelings, that only creates more pain, more resentment." Richard watched the scene, amazed at the strength Hannah was showing. "You deserve justice, Sarah," Hannah continued, "but not this way. Not by destroying the chance to have a real family." "Family?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "What family? The one that rejected me? The one that hid my existence?" "No," Hannah replied softly. "The family you can build now. Richard knows the truth. He's willing to fight for you, and I'm sure that together you can fix the mistakes of the past." Richard approached his sister, extending his hand. Hannah is right. I can't change the past, but I can help build a different future. You're my sister, Sarah. And it's time everyone knew that. Sarah looked at the extended hand, then at Hannah, and finally at the portrait of her biological mother that she kept discreetly on her desk. Years of anger, of planning, of revenge. Was it time to leave all that behind? And what about the inheritance? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. We'll resolve this legally, Richard assured. I have all the necessary evidence, but not as enemies, as siblings. Hannah watched the scene with a heavy heart. She had prepared herself to lose everything, Richard's love, her mother's treatment, by confronting Sarah. But maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for everyone to find peace. Sarah slowly stood, up, her green eyes the same as Richard's, shining with contained tears. I spent so much time planning my revenge, she said softly, that I almost forgot what it's like to have a real family. It was at this moment that Richard did something no one expected. He hugged his sister. Sarah resisted for an instant, decades of hurt and resentment trying to keep the barriers up. But then, like a dam that finally gives way, she surrendered to the embrace, letting the tears flow freely. The dinner at the Thompson mansion was set for 8 o'clock. Regina paced back and forth in the living room, supervising the last details of the decoration. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the flowers in the center of the table. "You need to calm down," said Richard, observing his mother's agitation. Sarah confirmed she's coming. "That's precisely why," Regina replied, finally stopping to face her son. "How am I going to look her in the eyes? How am I going to explain so many years of lies?" Richard completed softly. "That's why we're here, Mom, to start fixing things." Hannah, who was helping arrange the cutlery, felt her heart tighten seeing Regina's nervousness. In the last few weeks, since the confrontation in Sarah's office, much had changed. Richard had not only forgiven Hannah, but reaffirmed his love for her, finally understanding the motives behind her actions. The doorbell rang, making Regina freeze. Richard gently squeezed his mother's shoulder before going to answer. Sarah looked stunning in a simple black dress, but her eyes revealed the same anxiety that dominated everyone. "Welcome," said Richard, hugging his sister. The gesture, still new to both, carried the weight of decades of separation. Sarah returned the hug timidly, her eyes scanning the environment she knew only from old photos. "Sarah," Regina's voice trembled as she pronounced the name. You don't need to say anything now," Sarah interrupted, her voice controlled. "I'm here to listen mainly." The tension in the air was palpable as everyone sat at the table. The silence was only broken when the housekeeper began to serve the appetizer. "Where's Dad?" Richard asked, noticing the patriarch's absence. Regina lowered her eyes. He's not ready for this yet." "Typical," Sarah muttered, but without the usual bitterness in her voice. "Some things never change, but others can change," Hannah intervened softly. "That's why we're here, isn't it?" Sarah looked at Hannah with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. The woman she had tried to use as a pawn in her game of revenge had ironically become the bridge for her reconciliation with the family. "How's your mother, Hannah?" Sarah asked, her voice softer. "Getting better every day," Hannah replied, smiling. "The doctors are optimistic, and thank you, Sarah. Despite everything, you saved her life." Regina watched the interaction with tears in her eyes. "Sarah," she began hesitantly, "I know nothing I say can erase the past, but you look so much like your mother. She was an extraordinary woman." Sarah froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. You knew her?" "Yes," Regina admitted, her hands trembling as she picked up a napkin. "In the last years before she passed, we met in secret. She showed me your photos, told me about your achievements in school." Tears began to stream down Sarah's face. "Why did you never tell me?" "Because I was a coward," Regina answered simply. "Because it was easier to pretend nothing was happening than to face the mistakes we made." Richard took Hannah's hand under the table, seeking strength. Seeing his mother finally facing the truth was as painful as it was liberating. "I have something for you," said Regina, standing up. She returned moments later with an old wooden box. "Your mother gave this to me before she left. She asked me to keep it until the right moment came." Sarah opened the box with trembling hands. Inside were dozens of letters, photos, and small objects, memories of a life she barely knew. "She never stopped loving you," Regina continued, "and I never stopped feeling guilty for being complicit in this whole situation." The silence that followed was different from the previous one. It was no longer laden with tension, but with shared sadness, regrets, and lost possibilities. "I can't promise I'll forgive everything at once," Sarah finally said, "but I can promise I'll try to understand." Richard observed his sister with admiration. The strong and determined woman who had built an empire was there, vulnerable, trying to rebuild bridges she thought were definitively burned. "There's something you need to know," Hannah suddenly said, her voice trembling slightly. All eyes turned to her. She looked at Richard, who nodded encouragingly. "I'm pregnant." The news fell like a bomb of joy in the charged environment. Regina brought her hands to her face, tears of happiness replacing those of regret. Sarah, for the first time tonight opened a genuine smile. "So," said Sarah, her voice choked, "besides being a sister, I'm going to be an aunt." Richard stood up, going to Hannah and hugging her from behind. "Yes, and we hope you'll be a very present aunt." "And as for the baby," Hannah continued, "we'd like him or her to grow up knowing the whole truth about our family. No secrets, no lies." Regina nodded vigorously. "Yes, no more secrets. This child will grow up knowing exactly who their family is." Sarah looked at the box of memories in her lap, then at her brother and sister-in-law, and finally at Regina. Years of anger and resentment were slowly beginning to give way to something new: hope. "By the way," said Sarah, discreetly wiping away a tear, "I've already started the legal procedures to divide the inheritance, but this time we're going to do everything in the open." "And what about Vertex and Richard's company?" Hannah asked, concerned. "How about a merger?" Sarah suggested, surprising everyone. "After all, we're stronger together than apart." Richard felt his heart expand with love and gratitude. There in that room were the most important people in his life. His wife carrying his child, his sister finally found, and his mother bravely facing her mistakes. Alexander Thompson's private office, on the 20th floor of one of the most luxurious buildings on Park Avenue, was a sanctuary of power and tradition. Sitting in his Italian leather armchair, he observed the city through the bulletproof windows, an untouched glass of whiskey on his mahogany desk. "So you came," he said, without turning, upon hearing the door open. "We need to talk, Dad," Richard replied, entering the office. Behind him, Sarah hesitated for a moment before also crossing the threshold. Alexander Thompson finally turned, his eyes scanning the figure of the daughter he hadn't seen in decades. Time had been kind to Sarah. She had the same elegance and strength that her biological mother possessed. "You two here together," Alexander commented, his voice controlled. "I imagine this means that all our careful family arrangement is crumbling." "It's not crumbling, Dad," Richard corrected. "It's being rebuilt. It just depends on whether you want to be part of this reconstruction or not." Sarah remained silent, her eyes fixed on the man who had denied her existence for so long. It was strange how he seemed simultaneously bigger and smaller than in her childhood memories. "And what exactly do you expect from me?" Alexander asked, finally picking up his glass of whiskey. "That I ask for forgiveness? That I deny everything I did to protect our family, our name?" "Protect?" Sarah's voice finally cut through the air, trembling slightly. "Is that what you call abandoning your own daughter? Denying her existence? Stealing her inheritance?" Alexander abruptly stood up, his face red. "You don't understand. I had responsibilities, obligations." "To whom?" Richard interrupted. "To the bank, to the shareholders, and your obligations as a father?" "Don't come at me with moral lessons, Richard," Alexander shot back. "You have no idea of the difficult choices I had to make." "Choices?" Sarah laughed humorlessly. "What was the difficult choice, Dad? When you decided I didn't deserve your name? Or when you convinced Uncle Alexander to accept me as his daughter? only to then expel him from the family when he tried to fight for my rights. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander sat back down, suddenly looking very old and tired. "Your mother," he began, his voice softer. "She was extraordinary. She wasn't just a bank employee, as everyone thinks. She was brilliant, had revolutionary ideas for the time. We fell in love while working together on an international expansion project." Sarah felt tears in her eyes. It was the first time she heard her father speak of her mother. "But the board had already arranged my marriage to Regina," Alexander continued. "The merger with the Almeida Bank depended on it. Thousands of jobs were at stake, the future of two of the country's largest financial institutions." "And that justifies everything?" Richard asked, his voice laden with disappointment. "No," Alexander replied, surprising everyone, including himself. "It doesn't justify it, but at the time it seemed like the only way out. Regina, she was much more understanding than I deserved. She accepted the situation, helped create the arrangement with Alexander." "And after?" Sarah pressed. "After, Mom, after she was gone. Why did you continue denying my existence?" Alexander stood up again, walking to a painting on the wall. Carefully, he removed the painting, revealing a safe. After entering the combination, he took out an old folder. "Your grandfather," he said, extending the folder to Sarah, "left this for you, their bank shares, properties, everything that should have been yours by right. I never had the courage to destroy the documents." Sarah took the folder with trembling hands. "Why? Why keep all this if you never intended to give it to me?" "Because you're my daughter," Alexander replied, his voice finally breaking. "Because every time I thought about destroying these papers, it was like trying to erase your existence once again, and I couldn't do it." Richard observed the scene with a mix of emotions. Seeing his father, always so strong and unshakable, finally showing vulnerability, was both disturbing and liberating. "Hannah is pregnant," he said softly. "You're going to be a grandfather, Dad, and we want this child to know their entire family, their whole history." Alexander turned abruptly, surprised by the news. "Hannah, that teacher, the one Sarah used to... the one who helped us rebuild our family," Sarah firmly corrected. "She had every reason to hate me, to denounce me, but instead she showed me that there was still hope for reconciliation." "And what about the merger of the companies?" Alexander asked, clearly trying to process all the information. "I heard rumors about Vertex and Thompson Tech." "That depends on you, Dad," Richard replied. "Sarah and I have already decided to work together. The question is, are you going to continue living in the past, or are you going to help us build the future?" Alexander slowly walked to his desk, picked up the whiskey glass and emptied it in one gulp. Then, for the first time in decades, he truly looked at his daughter. "You have her eyes," he said softly. "The same determined eyes that made me fall in love with your mother." Sarah felt more tears escape. "Dad!" "I can't change the past," he continued. "I can't undo the choices I made. But maybe we can try to build something new." Richard approached, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "That's all we ask, a chance." "Regina is organizing a dinner on Sunday," said Sarah, her voice trembling slightly, "to celebrate Hannah's pregnancy. It would be important if you came." Alexander nodded slowly. "Sunday," he repeated, as if testing the word. I'll be there." When Richard and Sarah left the office, the city outside seemed different. The sun was beginning to set, painting the New York sky with shades of pink and orange. "Do you think he'll really show up?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying a vulnerability that Richard rarely saw. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "But he took the first step, and sometimes that's all we need to start." On the way home, Richard called Hannah, telling her about the meeting. She listened in silence, her heart overflowing with love and hope for the man she had chosen as her husband, and for the family that was slowly healing. Sunday dawned sunny, a perfect day for a family lunch. Hannah was in the kitchen of the Thompson mansion, helping Regina prepare the dessert when she felt a slight dizziness. Immediately, her mother-in-law made her sit down. "You need to rest," Regina insisted, handing her a glass of water. "You shouldn't be here helping me." "I'm pregnant, not sick," Hannah smiled, but accepted the glass. It was strange how Regina, who before could barely look her in the eyes, now treated her with such affection. "You know," Regina began, sitting next to her, "when I found out I was pregnant with Richard, I was stubborn like that too. I wanted to do everything by myself, prove that I was capable." Hannah noticed the shadow that passed over her mother-in-law's face. It must have been difficult, knowing about Sarah. Regina sighed deeply. "It was the most confusing period of my life. I loved Alexander, even knowing everything. And when Sarah was born, she was so beautiful, so innocent. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice in accepting that arrangement." "You did what you thought was best at the time," Hannah consoled. "The important thing is that now everyone is trying to fix things." Outside in the garden, Richard and Sarah were talking while setting the table for lunch. The morning was pleasantly cool and the scent of roses from the garden filled the air. "Do you think he'll really come?" Sarah asked for the 10th time, nervously adjusting the cutlery. Richard smiled affectionately at his sister. It was fascinating how Sarah, always so confident and determined in the business world, could seem so vulnerable when it came to family matters. "He'll come," he answered, trying to convey more confidence than he actually felt. "But even if he doesn't, you have us now." Sarah stopped what she was doing, looking at her brother with teary eyes. "Sometimes I still can't believe how everything has changed. A few months ago, I was planning to destroy this family. And now you're helping to rebuild it," Richard completed, hugging her. "Life has a funny way of changing our plans, doesn't it?" The sound of a car approaching made them both turn towards the gate. Alexander Thompson's black Mercedes slowly entered the driveway, parking near the house. For a few moments, that seemed like an eternity. No one moved. Finally, Alexander got out of the car. He was more casual than usual, wearing linen pants and a light shirt, a rare sight for a man always so formal. In his hands, he carried 2 packages. "Dad," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Alexander approached hesitantly, as if testing each step. I brought something for you," he said, extending the packages. The first was for Hannah, an old photo album carefully restored. When she opened it, she found photos of the Thompson family through the generations. "For the baby to know their history," Alexander explained, his voice hoarse. "All the stories, including those we tried to hide." The second package was for Sarah. Inside was a blue velvet box. When she opened it, she found a pearl necklace. "It was your mother's," Alexander said softly. "She wore it when we met. I kept it all these years, hoping—" Sarah couldn't contain her tears. With trembling hands, she touched the pearls her mother had worn decades ago. "May I?" Alexander asked, picking up the necklace. Sarah nodded, turning so he could place it around her neck. The moment was interrupted by a small cry coming from the kitchen. Everyone turned alarmed, only to see Hannah running towards the bathroom, followed by Regina. "Morning sickness," Richard explained, smiling, or rather all-day sickness, according to Hannah. Alexander observed the commotion with a soft expression that no one was used to seeing on his face. "Do you already know if it's a boy or a girl?" he asked, surprising everyone with his interest. "Not yet," Richard replied, "but Hannah is sure it's a girl, says she can feel it." "Your mother said the same thing," Alexander commented, looking at Sarah. "And she was right." The lunch proceeded in a surprisingly light atmosphere. Hannah, recovered from the nausea, charmed everyone with stories of her students. Sarah talked about plans for the merger of the companies, her eyes shining with professional enthusiasm. Regina, more relaxed than she had been in years, smiled, observing her reunited family. "There's one thing we need to discuss," Alexander said during dessert. Everyone tensed, fearing the moment of peace would be broken. "It's about the baby's last name." "What do you mean, Dad?" Richard asked, confused. "The baby will be a Thompson," Alexander continued, looking directly at Sarah. "Just as you should." have been from the beginning. That's why before this child is born, I want to officially recognize your name, Sarah Thompson, as it always should have been. Sarah covered her mouth with her hands, unable to contain her emotion. Hannah, sitting next to her, held her hand in support. I can't change the past, Alexander said, his voice choked. I can't erase the choices I made, the people I hurt. But I can try to do things differently from now on. If you'll allow me. Regina was the first to stand up, walking to her husband and hugging him. Soon Richard joined them. Sarah remained seated. For a moment, years of hurt and resentment weighing on her heart. Then slowly she stood up too. Dad, she called softly. Alexander turned, tears streaming down his face. Sarah had never seen him cry before. Thank you for coming today. The hug that followed was decades of distance finally being overcome, of secrets being forgiven, of love finding its way back. Hannah observed the scene with tears in her eyes, one hand resting gently on her still imperceptible belly. There was her family, imperfect, complicated, but finally complete. And in a few months, this family would grow even more. 6 months had passed since the lunch that changed the dynamics of the Thompson family. The mansion, once a symbol of secrets and hurts, was now decorated in soft shades of pink and lilac, prepared to host the baby shower for little Laura, a name chosen in honor of Sarah's mother. Hannah, with her now prominent belly, was supervising. The final decoration details when Sarah entered, carrying another box of gifts. More gifts? Hannah laughed. Sarah, you've already bought half the baby stores in New York. She's my only niece, Sarah defended herself, caressing her sister-in-law's belly. Besides, these are special. I found some things that were mine when I was a baby and Mom had kept everything. The mention of Laura, Sarah's mother, no longer brought that sharp pain from before. Now her name was spoken with affection, her memories openly celebrated in the family. You know, said Sarah, sitting next to Hannah, sometimes I wonder what she would think of all this. The reconciliation, the baby. She would be proud, Hannah replied softly. Proud of the strong woman you've become, of how you managed to transform pain into forgiveness. In the mansion's library, Richard and Alexander were meeting with Charles, finalizing the documents that would officially merge the companies and legally recognize Sarah as a Thompson. Are you sure you want to do this, Dad? Richard asked, watching Alexander sign the papers. Hand over control of the holding company to both of us. Alexander smiled, a gesture that was becoming more frequent in recent months. It's past time for me to retire. Besides, you two together, you're much more competent than I ever was. Charles, who had witnessed the entire transformation of the family, couldn't help but smile. Who would have thought, huh? A few months ago we were investigating a supposed scammer, and now we understand that sometimes what looks like betrayal is actually the path to redemption, Richard completed, thinking about how his initial distrust of Hannah had almost prevented him from experiencing all this happiness. Regina entered the library, her eyes shining with emotion. The guests are arriving, and there's a special surprise for you in the living room. When they arrived in the main living room, they found an unexpected visitor. Uncle Alexander, the uncle who had raised Sarah, was standing in the center of the room, visibly emotional. Uncle Alex! Sarah ran to hug him, tears streaming down her face. Alexander Sr. was paralyzed for a moment, staring at the brother he hadn't seen in decades. Alexander, in turn, maintained a serious expression, years of hurt still visible in his eyes. Regina called me, Alexander Sr. explained. Said the family was reuniting again, that you finally... His voice faltered as he looked at Sarah. Forgive me, brother, Alexander said, his voice choked. For everything, for using you, for then pushing you away. Alexander Sr. raised his hand, interrupting him. I didn't come here to receive apologies, Alexander. I came because, he looked at Sarah with affection, because my daughter is going to be an aunt, and because maybe it's time to leave the past in the past. The embrace between the brothers was decades of distance being overcome. Hannah, observing the scene, felt the baby move in her belly. "She's active today," she commented, taking Richard's hand and placing it on her belly. "She knows today is a special day," he replied, kissing his wife's forehead. The baby shower proceeded in an atmosphere of joy and reconciliation. Mrs. Davis, Hannah's mother, now completely recovered thanks to the treatment, charmed everyone with stories from her daughter's childhood. In a quiet moment, Sarah found an old photo among the gifts she had brought. In it, her biological mother held a small pink bundle, herself newborn. "She never stopped loving you," Alexander said, who had approached silently. "And I never stopped thinking about you two. Every day, every decision." Sarah looked at her father, seeing for the first time not the powerful man who had denied her, but a human being who had made mistakes trying to protect what he thought was important. "I know, Dad," she replied softly. "Now I know." On the other side of the room, Hannah was talking with Alexander Sr., discovering stories from Sarah's childhood that even Richard didn't know. "She was always determined," Alexander Sr. recounted proudly. "From a young age, she knew exactly what she wanted, just like her mother." "And her father," Hannah added, looking meaningfully at Alexander. The afternoon wore on, and guests began to say their goodbyes. Regina, exhausted but happy, observed her reunited family, Alexander and Alexander Sr. talking like in the old days, Sarah showing old photos to Richard, Hannah resting on the couch with her hand on her belly. "You know what's most incredible?" she commented to Charles, who was also observing the scene. "How love can heal even the deepest wounds." "It wasn't just love, Regina," Charles replied wisely. "It was the courage to face the truth, to admit mistakes, to forgive." A small kick from Laura, as if agreeing with Charles's words, made Hannah smile. In a few months, that little life growing inside her would be another link in that chain of love and forgiveness that had transformed the Thompson family. The New York Presbyterian Hospital was quiet on that spring dawn. In the maternity ward hallway, the Thompson family anxiously waited. Sarah paced back and forth while Alexander held Regina's hand, who was praying softly. Alexander Sr. observed the scene with a serene smile, thinking about how life had changed in recent months. Inside the delivery room, Hannah breathed deeply, following the medical team's instructions. Richard, by her side, held her hand, transmitting strength and love with each squeeze. "You can do it, my love," he whispered. Laura is almost here." With a final effort and a strong, healthy cry, Laura Thompson came into the world. The little one had the characteristic green eyes of the Thompsons, and to everyone's surprise, the same dark curls that her grandmother Laura, Sarah's mother, had in the old photos. "She's perfect," Hannah whispered, tears of happiness streaming down her face as she held her daughter for the first time. Richard kissed his wife's forehead, also emotional. "Thank you," he said, "for everything, for not giving up on us even when I doubted you, for helping me find my sister, for giving me this family." Outside, when news of the birth arrived, Sarah was the first to enter the room, eager to meet her niece. Upon seeing little Laura, she couldn't contain her tears. "She has Mom's eyes," she said softly, touching her niece's tiny hand. Alexander, who entered next with Regina, stopped at the door upon hearing the comment. For a moment, he was transported, decades into the past, to the day he had held Sarah for the first time secretly in the same hospital. "Dad," Sarah called, noticing his hesitation. "Do you want to hold your granddaughter?" With trembling hands, Alexander took the small bundle. Laura opened her green eyes, looking directly at him, and at that moment something in his heart was completed. "Welcome to the family, little Laura," he said, his voice choked. "A family that your arrival helped heal." Regina approached, hugging her husband as he held their granddaughter. Alexander Sr., observing the scene from the door, felt his eyes water. "It's amazing," he commented, "how such a small life can bring so much change." "It wasn't just her," Hannah replied, smiling tiredly but happily. "It was love, the love Sarah had for her mother, which made her fight for justice. The love Richard had for me, which made him overcome distrust. Regina's love, which kept secrets for so long to protect everyone. Alexander's love, which even buried under years of guilt never ceased to exist. And your love, Sarah completed, holding her sister-in-law's hand, which even when I tried to use you as a pawn in my revenge game, saw beyond my pain and helped me find forgiveness. Mrs. Davis, who had arrived shortly after the birth, observed the scene with gratitude. Her treatment had been a complete success, and now she could see her granddaughter grow up. Sometimes, she said, God uses mysterious ways to fix what's broken. Who would have thought that this whole story would begin with a misunderstanding? At a wedding? Richard smiled, remembering that night that seemed to have happened in another life. The envelope with the money proofs, his anger, the pain in Hannah's eyes. Everything had been necessary to get here. You know what's most incredible, he said, taking Laura in his arms, how true love always finds its way, even through lies, secrets, hurts. And now, Alexander Sr. asked, what happens after happily? Ever after? Sarah smiled, adjusting the pearl necklace that her mother had worn, the same one she now rarely took off. Now we live, Uncle. We live and love and build new memories. Now we teach Laura that family isn't just blood, it's choice. That forgiveness isn't weakness, it's strength. That love is the only thing that really matters in the end. The first morning lights began to enter through the room's window, bathing the reunited family in a soft golden hue. Laura slept peacefully, oblivious to the miracle her existence represented. The miracle of uniting people, of healing wounds, of transforming revenge into forgiveness. Regina picked up the camera she had brought. Let's record this moment, she said, the first photo of the complete Thompson family. Everyone gathered around Hannah's bed. Alexander and Regina, Sarah and Alexander Sr., Richard holding Laura, Hannah smiling radiantly, Mrs. Davis beside her. Daughter? The photo captured not just people gathered, but the love that had transformed their lives. To Laura, Sarah said, symbolically raising her hand as if in a toast. May she grow up knowing she's loved, not just for who she is, but for everything she represents. The new beginning, the healing, the union. To love, Richard completed, gently kissing his daughter's forehead, which taught us that sometimes we need to lose everything to find what really matters. Hannah looked at her gathered family, the family she had found through such an unlikely path, and felt her heart overflow with gratitude. The sun was rising outside, bringing a new day, a new life, a new beginning. And so, with Laura's birth, the Thompson family was finally complete. Not perfect, because perfection doesn't exist in real families, but united by love, by forgiveness, by the understanding that sometimes life's greatest treasures are born from its greatest pains. Laura would grow up hearing this story, the story of how her parents' love overcame distrust, of how her Aunt Sarah found forgiveness in her heart, of how her grandparents learned that it's never too late to correct the mistakes of the past. And most importantly, she would grow up knowing she was loved, deeply and unconditionally loved. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of love, forgiveness, and redemption of the Thompson family has touched your hearts. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories. If this narrative moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of human relationships. Tell us in the comments, which city are you following us from? Your opinion is very important to us. Until next time.